Neck, New Jersey, 07666. Anyway, so that's how we got this opportunity. Elana has done this for many institutions. I'm going to read a little bit of her bio. I wasn't going to, but I just took a glance at it, and it's so impressive that I would feel badly if I didn't impress you with this fantastic, fantastic bio. Elana Kaplan, our speaker this evening, is a museum educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and at the Dörfner Judaica Museum. She has created and leads an integrated learning and museum tour for both adults and school groups. Elana presents virtual museum tours for groups around the globe. She got her BA from Barnard and a double master's degree from NYU in Jewish history and museum studies. So it's really very exciting, a great entrance into planning for Pesach, now that Purim's over and it's less than 4 weeks away. So Elana, thanks so much for joining us, and take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Lisa, for your introduction and for all your help, and Rabbi Freiberg and Liz Browser also for setting all of this up. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining tonight and for having me. As Lisa just said, I was actually just reading a Dvar Torah today, and it talked about how 30 days before Pesach that you should start, getting ready and preparing. And people look at that different ways, I'm sure. Some people start shopping or maybe cooking, cleaning, I don't know. But hopefully tonight, we are going to start preparing by looking at objects from the ancient Egyptian collection at the Met. And that'll begin our preparations for the upcoming holiday of Pesach, which is, I think, about 30 days away. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm an educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And today we are going to explore some of the Met's collection together, the ancient Egyptian collection. The Met has over 30,000 ancient Egyptian objects. So we're just gonna kind of touch the surface, but it's a wonderful way to start preparing for Pesach and also to envision a lot of the things, a lot of the stories and things that we've read about in Tanakh about the Jews in Egypt. So just a little bit about what we're gonna be doing tonight. My program lasts about an hour. And then I leave time at the end for questions. If anyone has questions during the program, please put them in the chat. I'm not going to answer them during the program. I just don't want to break up the flow, but I will answer questions from the chat at the end. And also I'm happy for people to unmute at the end and ask questions live. Okay, so I am going to start off with my screen share. Okay, can everyone see? Thumbs up, you can see my screen share? Okay, great. All right, so I'm bringing everyone to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The Met itself has over 2 million objects, but in the ancient Egyptian collection alone, over 30,000 objects. So it's a very large collection. So just to talk a little bit about the background, how do we have more than 30,000 objects in the Met's collection? So, early on in the early 1900s, the Egyptian government invited museums and archaeologists from around the world to send archaeologists to ancient Egypt. And they had a system which was called partage, and partage means to share. So basically the setup was that the Egyptian government invited all these archaeologists from around the world, and whatever they found on their archaeological digs, half had to stay in Egypt and half could go to the host museum. So there are many ways that this has been looked at since 1900. Some people see it as a very fair for both the museum sending the archaeologists and for Egypt, because Egypt got all the expertise of these archaeologists from all over the world. And of course, the museums all over the world got all these amazing objects from ancient Egypt. But other people feel that it really was a system of colonialism and it wasn't a fair system. Anyway, that happened in the early 1900s. Today, that does not happen anymore. The Met still does send archaeologists from the museum on digs. All the time they have archaeologists there, but we don't get to keep the objects. It's really just educational at this point. But that is how we were able to have this unbelievable collection of over 30,000 objects from the Met archaeologists that went from about the early 1900s through about the 1930s. By the way, the British Museum also has a huge collection at other museums around the world, and it was the same system for them as well. So that's how that's a little bit of a background of how we have all these objects. So what we're going to do is my program is going to be a mixture of looking at the objects up close, but also a virtual tour in the museum of these objects as well. So we're going to start off here with a picture from 1920 of one of those archaeological digs. This is a picture that one of the Met archaeologists took, and they were, digging in this area in 1920, and they came across an unbelievable find when they were digging in this mountain. They came across a tomb of a man named Mekhet-Re. Mekhet-Re was not a pharaoh, but he was an important official in ancient Egypt. And they came across his tomb. Now, he was buried in around 1986 BCE. So we're talking almost 4,000 years ago, 4,000 years before this expedition in 1920. When he was buried, right after he was buried, a lot of his tomb was invaded by grave robbers. That was very common after people were buried in ancient Egypt, because everybody knew that people were buried with unbelievable treasures, because they believed in the afterlife. So they wanted to be buried with all these things. So Mekhet-Re's tomb was invaded by grave robbers, but for some reason, these grave robbers missed 2 rooms. We don't know why. We don't know if, they got caught. We don't know if they found enough stuff. They were happy with what they found. We don't know if they just couldn't find these 2 rooms. We're not sure, but we are very happy that they didn't find these 2 rooms, because they were left untouched until the Met archaeologists set up camp here in 1920, and they found these rooms. So I'm going to show you a picture. There's a picture from 1920 of what one of the rooms looked like. So looking at this picture, you might get an idea of some of the things that were found. It was a room full of wooden models that were made, models of things that Mekhet-Re wanted to have in the afterlife. So I know it's a little bit jumbled, but you might be able to see that there's some boats. There's some wooden boats in here. There's some other wooden boxes. There are lots of models of people, wooden people, they're animals. Now, the reason, by the way, it looks a little bit jumbled together is because even though it was not touched since Mekhet-Re was buried, almost 4,000 years before the archaeologists entered the room. But if you think about the climate of Egypt, they have earthquakes and earth movements. So, that would have jumbled around some of the objects. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, before I show you these objects really clearly, I want to just take you into the museum and see what this room looks like, because it's one of my favorite rooms in the entire museum. So I'm going to take you onto a virtual tour. Now, I just want to let you know that the Met was at the forefront of virtual technology in 2010 when they did this. Unfortunately, they have not updated their technology because it's a huge undertaking. So because of that, the virtual tour isn't so clear, but I'm going to show you all the images in my PowerPoint afterwards. I just wanted to give you an idea of this room. So here we're in a room of the Mekhet-Re models. And I'm just going to move us around a little just to orient us. So here you see on the wall, it says the ancient models from the tomb of Mekhet-Re. Now, everything I just told you is written on the wall over here. And then you can see the picture we were just looking at is really big and blown up on the wall. Okay, so the models that we're looking at, you might have been able to see in the picture, are boat models and models of Mekhet-Re's estate. So when the archaeologists came in, they found 24 models, wooden models that Mekhet-Re was buried with. Half of them were models of boats that you can see on the right-hand side here. And half of them were models of Mekhet-Re's estate, which you can see on the left-hand side over here. Now, what's unbelievable about these models is, first of all, they're now more than 4,000 years old. They are the originals that were found. They also tell us they're very detailed, showing us a lot of detail about what life was like in ancient Egypt. Now, the Egyptians had a strong belief in the afterlife, and they believed they came back to life, and they needed everything that they had in life. They wanted to have it with them in the afterlife. So Mekhet-Re, as I said, was not a pharaoh, but he was a very important official in ancient Egypt, and he owned a lot of boats in his lifetime. He couldn't be buried in the tomb with all of these boats. So instead he had artists and artisans create all these boats throughout his life that would be buried with him in his tomb. So those are the boats that we see on the right. Now, remember, we have half of the boats. The museum in Cairo has the other half of the boats. And again, they tell us so much about life in ancient Egypt, what boats were like, why boats were important. And then again, on the left-hand side are the models of his estate, which we will look at close in a couple of minutes. Now, remember I said there were 2 rooms. So one of the rooms had all the Meket Ray models. The other room was a very small chamber where actually Meket Ray's, one of his servants named Wa was buried. And this is Wa's sarcophagus and some of the things he was buried with. Now you notice Meket Ray was buried with all these models, really unbelievable, plus all the other things Meket Ray was buried with that were robbed by tomb robbers that we will never know what else that was. Wa was buried with very simple things. You might see on the bottom his walking sticks, his sandals, and his layers of linen. But I wanted to just point this out to show that we do have actual mummies in the museum and remains of mummies. This was a little bit unusual that we have a mummification of a servant, but we do have Meket Ray's. We didn't find Meket Ray's mummy, but we did find his servant's mummy. So here's a kind of an overview of the room and what it looks like. As I said, it's one of my favorite places in the museum. And to me, this room really brings out stories from Tanakh, which I will show you up close through my clearer images in my PowerPoint. So we're going to go back to my PowerPoint and look at some of those boats really a little bit close and a little bit clearer. So as I said, Meket Ray owned a lot of boats in his lifetime. Boats were very important in ancient Egypt. They were important for trade, for travel, traveling on the Nile River. And the Egyptians also believed that they got to the afterlife on a boat. So boats were very important. The other thing that I think is so important, and this ties us to the story of the 10 plagues. So the first plague, right, is when Aaron turned the Nile to blood. So we always talk about how that was so devastating for the Egyptians because, you know, the drinking water was blood. And also the Nile River was used to water, you know, for agriculture, to water all the crops. So of course that was devastating for the Egyptians. And they bathed in the Nile River. But if you think about it also that the Nile was used for trade and travel, as we see with the importance of these boats. So now you have their source of trade and travel had also turned to blood. So that was so devastating for the economy, for trading, for leaving the country. And these boats really highlight it. Now I'm showing you Meket Ray's boats, but if you are at the Met, you'll see throughout the museum that many people were buried with boat models in ancient Egypt, which shows how important boats were, how important the Nile River was. The Nile River actually is the longest river in the world then and now. It goes through, I think, about 10 countries. And it was just so important to the Egyptians. So these boat models, again, these are the original boat models. They're about 4,000 years old. They were made in 1986 BCE. They show us about boats in ancient Egypt. They also show us that there were a lot of slaves in ancient Egypt. So yes, when the Jews were in Egypt for a long time, that they were slaves. Not at this time, by the way. As I said, these were made in 1986 BCE. The date that we put, the earliest date that anyone puts the Jews in Egypt was really 1650 BCE. So this is 300 years before that. But it gives you an idea that there were always a large class of slaves in ancient Egypt, because when the Egyptians conquered a country or a people, they would often take their people as slaves. Meket Ray actually is on this boat. He's the only one who's not working. He's sitting under this awning over here. Sitting over here. You will notice, as I said, the models are made out of painted wood, but you will notice that some of them are wearing a cloth bottom that's actually made out of linen. That is the original linen. You'll notice some of it has holes in it. And I think it's so interesting that the clothing and also the mummification was linen was the material that was used. And if you think of the mitzvah of shatnez, right, like not mixing wool and linen. So today linen is not a material that we really wear that often, but back then linen was the material that things were made out of. So so that's very interesting also, just seeing all this linen. And then also just looking at the boats and seeing the importance of boats and how boats function in, 4,000 years ago. This kind of steering wheel oar at the back. We have the guy in the front of the boat. He's measuring the Nile River to make sure to see how high it is, because we know that the Nile River would sometimes overflow and be very high, and sometimes it would be very low. In ancient Egypt, they thought that was controlled by the gods. If the gods were happy, the Nile River was, a good level. If they were angry, there wasn't enough water. They believed really everything was controlled by the gods. And of course, we know that has to do with tide and the weather and the moon cycle and all that, but they really believe that it was controlled by their gods. Okay, so let's just look at a couple more boats. I said we saw in the museum there are 7 of these boat models. So here we have another important type of boat in ancient Egypt, which is the fishing and fowling boat. And this teaches us how they would fish and fowl in ancient Egypt. They would do spear fishing. You can see some of the ducks that they caught, some of the animals. Again, we have Mecca right here. He's the only one who's not working. Everybody else is working. Again, we see that there are many, many slaves. It was a big part of the ancient Egyptian culture, having slaves, and it really kept their economy going. And one more boat that we have here. Again, the idea of the importance of trade, of travel. We have Mecca right here sitting. Again, he's the only one who's working. Everybody else has a job besides him. So again, we see how important boats were in ancient Egypt. It really brings the idea of the importance of the Nile River to life and really shows us how, again, how devastating that first plague would have been because of the reliance on the Nile River for so many different things. Okay, so now we're going to go on to really the models of Mequeret's estate. So we had seen those on the left side of the room, those boxes, but we weren't able to really see into them on the virtual tour. Now I'm giving you kind of a bird's eye view. So these models, again, really bring to life in ancient Egypt. So here's our first model of Mequeret's estate. I'm actually going to give us a bird's eye view, a better bird's eye view of it. So if you take a look around, you might figure out what's going on in this model. This is Mequeret's slaughterhouse. Okay, very detailed model. We can see Mequeret's slaughterhouse. You can see the animals that are being killed, the cows on the ground. You can see how they preserved meat in ancient Egypt. They would hang it up to dry. They would collect the blood in the corner. So a few very important things to tie us to our Tanakh story. And that is, first of all, a lot of people think that Egyptians didn't eat meat. But here we see they did eat meat. Now, it wasn't something that everybody ate because meat was very expensive. So only upper class people ate meat. But they did, people have this notion that because they worshiped animals, they didn't eat animals. But here we have proof that they did. And we have other sources that prove that they did also. The other thing that I wanted to point out is we read in Parshat Shemot about the idea of, and in the Haggadah we'll read about the idea of taskmasters, right? Like people who are in charge of the slaves. So here we see a visual of that, right? We have our slaves who are tying up the animals, who are probably slaughtering them. And then we have the men standing behind them that are holding spears on their backs to make sure that they're doing their work. So here we have a visualization of what a taskmaster looks like, someone who's in charge of other slaves. Okay, now we're going to move on to another slide. Okay, great. So here we have a source from Shemot 16:3, and it talks about, if you see in the Hebrew, it talks about al sir habasar. So the Jews said when they were in the desert, if only we had died by if we had died in the lands of Egypt when we sat by the flesh pots. It's translated as flesh pots, but in Hebrew, we see al sir habasar. So that shows us also that there was meat in ancient Egypt, right? People were sitting around, there were eating meat. Whether slaves were eating meat, I don't know, because again, it was very expensive. I've read only, wealthy people were eating meat. But the idea is, yes, that there was meat being eaten in ancient Egypt. And also it says, ba'achlenu lechem, when we ate our fill of bread. So we see the importance of meat and bread, right? Bread is really an important food in ancient Egypt. And now I want to show you that as a visual. Okay, so this is probably my favorite object in the entire ancient Egyptian collection. And again, that's because it just really brings the story of, for me, the story of Tanakh and of Yosef to life. So take a minute to look at this image. Some of you might be able to figure out what it is. And when I do this program with schools and make it's a little more interactive, I ask people, what do you see in this model? So this is actually a model of an ancient Egyptian granary. And this points out many, many important things to us. So first of all, let's just see how this granary works. We see these two guys over here. They are scribes. They're writing down exactly how much grain comes in, how much grain comes out. We have these people coming in with their, sacks of grain. They're going to go through the door, walk up the stairs, and then they're going to pour the grain into these pits that are in the granary. So first of all, this is Meccare's granary. So it's a model, so it's on a small scale. But I think it can help you visualize what Yosef was in charge of when he was in Egypt, right? He was in charge of Paro's granary. So Paro had a very large granary in ancient Egypt, and Yosef was in charge. He made sure that it was recorded how much grain was there so that they would save up grain during the 7 years of plenty, so that they would have grain during the 7 years of famine. And I imagine that the granary for Egypt that Yosef was in charge of is just a much larger scale of what we're looking at right here. Now, grain was very important in ancient Egypt, not just for the food that it made, but also it was a commodity. It was used as currency. And if we think about the brothers who came down to Egypt to buy grain, right, that they brought their sacks of money and they were going to purchase grain from Egypt. So grain was so important in many ways. And actually just a little interesting tidbit about this granary, when the archaeologists found this granary in the tomb, they actually knew that it was buried with real grain, because they found in the granary, they found little rat droppings, which meant that rats that could, squeeze through the walls of the tomb, they had come in and they had eaten a lot of grain from the bottom of the granary. So it was buried, Meccare was buried with a model of his granary with actual grain. Now, why was grain so important in ancient Egypt? So let's look at our next model from Meccare. So this is one view of it, but I also want to give you a bird's eye view. So between these two images, you'll see what they're making out of the grain. And I'm sure many of you are answering this in your minds or out loud. So why is grain so important? They use it to make bread. So you can see on the right side is the bakery. They're making bread. And they also used it to make a drink that is made out of fermented grain. You can see it a little bit better on this way. A drink that we can't drink on Pesach because it's made out of fermented grain, which is beer. Beer was actually a regular drink in ancient Egypt. It wasn't an alcoholic drink. It was, they take water from the Nile River, put it in these jars with some grain, let it ferment. It made the Nile River, probably the water taste better. And it was a regular drink in ancient Egypt. So we see the importance of grain for their bread, which was a staple, and their beer, which was a staple. And again, these models, I think, really just bring all of these ideas to life. And let's just look at some sources where we can bring our Tanakh to life here. So we know the story, of course, of Paro and his two officers that he threw into jail because he was angry with them, right? One was the chief baker. So of course, if bread is so important, you're going to have a chief baker. And the other was the winemaker. So not the beer maker. Wine was also important for Paro, but the idea of the importance of grain, right? We can see through these two figures. And then of course, we have the source about Yosef gathering all the grain, right? By boats that call ochel. So he gathered, and it's interesting that grain here, they translate the word ochel to be grain, right? That the food, right? Which was so important. So he gathered it for 7 years when they had the years of plenty, and he put it in, it says in Hebrew, be'arim, and it's translated in English, grain in the city. So he put it in these granaries. And collected it for 7 years so they would have it for when there was a famine. Okay, so our last model that we're going to look at it from Meccare's room is his garden. And again, all these models are made out of painted wood. So now I just want to return back to that original picture we were looking at. This is the first, picture that the archaeologists took before they started, looking at things and, removing or so you can see a number of the things we were just looking at. So, they actually came from this tomb. Right here, we can see that model of the garden, right? On the right side, we can see some of the boats. We can see this, the model here. Now, you might be wondering, but what about these other boats? We didn't see all these boats. We didn't see all these models. But remember, we only have half of them. The other half are in Egypt. So we just have half in our museum. But so I think that really brings a lot of the things to life, just seeing these models, and it really brings life in ancient Egypt to life. Okay, so now we're going to switch on to a whole new topic, and that is the topic of who was the pharaoh of the Exodus. So there's a lot written about this. I actually wrote an article that I think I sent to either Lisa or the rabbi, and they can feel free to share it. I wrote an article in our local Jewish newspaper about this. Who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? There are a lot of opinions, and it's not such an easy question to answer because, of course, you have dating from the Torah, and then you have dating from Egyptian archaeology. And of course, we know the Torah is not a book of chronology. So dates from 4,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago can be a little tricky. So there are different ideas, and I'm going to present two of them based on some research that I've done and that I've read. And I'm going to use some interesting objects to back up these ideas. So first, just a source from Malachim Aleph, which dates the Exodus for us here. So it says, in the 480th year after the Jews left the land of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, that is the second month, in the fourth year of his reign over Israel, Shlomo began to build the Beit HaMikdash. So basically, this is saying that Shlomo began to build the Beit HaMikdash 480 years after the Exodus. Okay, so people usually put that date of the fourth year of King Shlomo's rule. They usually put that date around 966 BCE. Give or take a couple of years, but we're going to put it around 966 BCE. So if you add 480 years to that, you will get to the year of 1479 BCE. So now if I look at the Egyptian pharaohs during that time in 1479 BCE, it's actually very interesting because that time period would be the rule of a female pharaoh whose name was Hatshepsut. So right now we are looking at the Sphinx of Hatshepsut, and any of you who have either kids or grandkids or in sixth grade, I know here in New York, I'm assuming they also learn Egyptian history in sixth grade. They will definitely know who Hatshepsut is. She was a female pharaoh, which was rare in ancient Egypt. She was very powerful and a very interesting figure that we're going to talk about. So I actually want to bring us back into the museum to look at the Met's Hatshepsut room to talk a little bit more about her. Okay, so as everyone is with me, Lisa, you can give me a thumbs up if you're with me in the museum in the Hatshepsut room. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we are in the room with the Hatshepsut. These are all sculptures of Hatshepsut. Okay, now what you might notice right away is I said she was a female pharaoh, and it does not look, she is really not presented as a female pharaoh in most of these sculptures. Now, the reason for that is because she was not supposed to be pharaoh. Her father was a pharaoh. He was Tutmosis the First. Her husband, who is also her half-brother, Tutmosis II, was a pharaoh. But when her husband died, their stepson, who was also her nephew, it's almost a little bit soap opera-ish, but anyway, her stepson, who was also her nephew, was supposed to become pharaoh, but he was a child. So Hatshepsut decided, you know what? I'm going to make myself pharaoh until our stepson gets older, and I'm going to rule Egypt. But I know that people are not going to be so happy because I'm making myself pharaoh. So she really wants to make herself very powerful. So she presents herself as a male pharaoh. You can see that she's wearing the traditional garb with the false beard, with a headdress, which would usually have a cobra on it. Here she's seen kneeling, holding offerings to the gods and goddesses. By the way, I know it's hard to tell because there are no people in this room, so you can't tell how big these sculptures are, but just to give you an idea, when I lecture in this room and stand in between, I reach up maybe to her elbows, and you can see in the back that there's actually a label on the wall, and usually labels are about eye level. So you can see how huge these sculptures are. They're really very big. You might also notice that a lot of them have broken parts on them or missing even bodies, right? Some of them we have heads, we don't have bodies. A lot of them are broken. Faces have broken parts to them. So by the way, these sculptures are all carved out of solid stone, limestone, marble, different materials. So they're not just going to break. Even if, you know, the weather's bad, they're not just going to break. A lot of these sculptures were purposely destroyed by Tutmosis the Third, who is angry that his stepmother took over, and he destroyed a lot of her sculptures. easiest to destroy a face because you can kind of, whack away at the nose, other parts. And actually, Tutmosis III did such a good job trying to erase his stepmother's reign that for many years, because he broke all of her sculptures and had them buried and erased her from the list of kings, for many years until 1822, nobody even knew that Hatshepsut was a ruler until some archaeologists found some stuff. So he was almost successful in having her name and her history taken away and destroyed. So you can see this is a room full of Hatshepsut sculptures. This is just what we have there. She had tons of sculptures made of herself to show how powerful she was. You will notice in the back, she does look a little bit more feminine in some of these sculptures. So we do have sculptures indicating that she was a female, but most of them, she appears to be a male. Okay, so now why am I spending so much time on Hatshepsut? And we're gonna go back to our Sphinx of Hatshepsut. By the way, Sphinx shows how most pharaohs had a Sphinx made of them to show how powerful they were, right? They were like a lion, body of a lion, head of a pharaoh. They were so powerful like a lion. How do I know this is Hatshepsut? Because as I said, she looks like a male, and actually none of the sculptures in ancient Egypt showed any personalization. They all look the same. So how do we know? You might see their hieroglyphics in the middle of her paws. We can also sometimes figure out from dating or from where the sculpture were found, but luckily most of them have hieroglyphics on them. Okay, so why is Hatshepsut important for our story today? So as I said, if we use our dating from Malachim Aleph that we were just looking at, and we say that the Exodus happened around the year 1479 BCE, that is when Hatshepsut was pharaoh. So I actually believe that this could fit in very well. And I will give you a couple of sources why I think. So first of all, that's just me in the museum recently. The museum is open. That's me with the Hatshepsut sculpture recently. And this is just another sculpture of Hatshepsut, again, showing her as a male, showing her powerful. By the way, she couldn't be the military ruler because only male pharaohs could do that. So she couldn't conquer land like her father did, but she actually did all these unbelievable trade expedition, and she increased the I guess the GDP of Egypt greatly. She was a very powerful ruler. Okay, so let's here's a close-up of a sculpture where she does appear as a woman. We do have sculptures where she does appear as a woman, so we do, have that documented, of course. Again, you can see the hieroglyphics, which tells us it's Hatshepsut. Again, notice a lot of it's broken because of her stepson who was angry at her. But this is carved out of marble. She's wearing a necklace, a skirt, so there's a feminine, and it's a very kind of feminine-looking sculpture. So she was sometimes presented as a female, but mostly as a male. Okay, so let's look at some of our sources and see how we can reconcile that with Hatshepsut, the pharaoh of the Exodus, being a female pharaoh. Okay, so here we have okay, so after a long time, the king of Egypt died, and the Jews were, crying out from their hard work. So this pasuk shows us that there were two different pharaohs, right? There's the pharaoh of the bondage, of the slavery, and then the pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, Hatshepsut only ruled for about 20 years. She died in 1458 BCE. When she died, her stepson took over by himself. And again, he was really angry, so he destroyed a lot of sculptures. But the time works here because, right, we had the pharaoh of the we had more than one pharaoh of the slavery because the Jews were slaves for anywhere from 86 to 110 years. So there were more than one pharaoh of slavery, but we do see here that there was a pharaoh who died, this pharaoh of bondage, and then a new pharaoh of the Exodus. So that pharaoh of the Exodus would have been Tutmosis III. And I'm sorry, Hatshepsut was a pharaoh of bondage, and Tutmosis III was a pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay, now how could that go in with our sources here? So here we have from Shemot Aleph, it says, Vayakam melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yadat Yosef. So we all have read different interpretations of this. Was it a new king, really a new king? Was it a king who just pretended not to, who forgot Yosef's, everything he did and pretended not to know? So now if we say that we're talking about Hatshepsut was a pharaoh of bondage, and we say Vayakam melech hadash. So there are interpretations that say melech hadash means a new king, a usurper, someone who wasn't supposed to be king, which of course would fit in with Hatshepsut. She was a usurper. She was not supposed to be king. Now, and then interesting, what did this pharaoh do in our next source? So this is the pharaoh who ordered the midwives to kill the boy babies. And look at the wording that we have here, right? So the Vayomer be'aledchen et ha'ivriot, when you deliver the Hebrew women, or iten al ha'avnayim. Okay, so what does that word mean? So here we have it translated as the birth stool. Okay, so this was a specific birth stool, and who would have been so familiar with the birthing process if it weren't a female pharaoh, right? That makes a lot of sense, that she was so familiar with the birthing process and a birth stool that she was instructing the midwives on what to do. So an interesting twist on the story, but it fits in with the dating. Okay, so that is the idea of Hatshepsut being the pharaoh at this time, female pharaoh. And as I said, when her son, Tutmosis III, took over, so according to this dating, he would be the pharaoh of the Exodus. He was very angry. He had a lot of her sculptures destroyed. He tried to wipe out her memory, and he was pretty successful until 1822. So from 1458 BCE until 1822, nobody knew about Hatshepsut. And the reason that I'm repeating that is because a lot of people will say to me, you know, do you have in the museum artifacts that show that the Jews were in Egypt? We want to see proof that the Jews were in Egypt. So no, we don't have any artifacts. There isn't any archaeology that specifically points to the Jews being in Egypt. And there are many ways to answer that question, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But if you see that pharaohs controlled what information was disseminated and what they wanted to be around, right? Like Tutmosis III wanted Hatshepsut to be wiped out, and he was almost successful. For 4,000 years, he was successful if these archaeologists hadn't found some of her many sculptures that were made of her. So there was a lot of manipulation of information that was going on, and the pharaohs wanted to control that. So they wouldn't have wanted knowledge of a mass exodus of their slaves that left Egypt. They would not have wanted that information to be recorded for posterity. And we'll talk about that a little bit later also. Okay, now there's another opinion that I'm sure many of you have heard, that Ramses was the pharaoh of the Exodus. And there are people who date the Exodus to 1290 BCE. Again, there are different dates. We're looking at Tanakh dates. We're looking at Seder Olam dates, different dates. There are people who date the Exodus to 1290 BCE. And if that's so, then it would be this Ramses II was pharaoh at that time period. Now, I have some problems with that dating, but let's talk about it a little. So first of all, I just wanted to show you this. I actually went to Egypt in the mid 90s when I was mid to late 90s when I was studying in Israel. I went on a trip to Egypt before I was even interested in this. And I took some of these pictures. So I just wanted to show you this because to me, it shows we don't have these such huge sculptures in the museum as you'll find in Egypt. But this is a sculpture of Ramses II, who some people say was a pharaoh of the Exodus. So I just want to give you the size of this sculpture. So this is me standing next to Ramses' head, and this is my friend lying down next to the sculpture of Ramses. So just to give you an idea, okay, so the pharaohs thought of themselves as larger than life and great, and they made these sculptures to represent themselves as these huge, larger than life figures. So, you know, just keep that in mind as you're studying the Parsha, as you're studying or learning about the Haggadah, that how powerful they made themselves. And these sculptures were all over Egypt. They were all over. So this is what, you know, people were looking at. This is what the Jews were looking at, the fear, right? And the idea of, you know, Moshe approaching these people who thought they were so great and had these great, you know, these sculptures made of them is kind of puts the whole story, I think, into perspective. And also the idea of why Moshe wanted the Jews to leave to, you know, worship Hashem. Like, how could they really worship in these areas? And we'll see that also when we see some of the temples. Anyway, so this is the huge sculpture of Ramses II. And as I said, there are many people who think that he is the pharaoh of the Exodus. And they say that not only because of the date, but also because of these sources we have here that we're all familiar with, that, you know, so we have here our reference, by the way, the taskmasters, right? The Sarei Misim, which we saw in our Meket Ray models, that visualization, but they were building these cities for Paro, Pitom, and Ramses. So there are people who say, you know, the Jews were building this city called Ramses, so Ramses must have been the pharaoh. So there are a couple of problems with that. So number one is, if you look back, that's a source from Shemot. But if you look back to Bereshit, right, when Yosef settled his family in Goshen, Goshen was actually in a region called Ramses. So that was way before these cities were built. So the other issue is that although Ramses II, who we were just looking at his sculpture, although he was the most powerful Ramses, he ruled for 67 years, which was, I think, the longest ruling of pharaoh for sure, one of the longest ruling monarchs. If you think about, I think the average lifespan in those days was like 30 or 40. So he ruled for 67 years. He lived to be in his 90s. So he was a very powerful ruler. However, he was not the only Ramses. There were actually 11 pharaohs named Ramses, Ramses 1 through 11. This is Ramses II. There was a pharaoh named Ramses who ruled Egypt for a total of 230 years. So we can't really date that, you know, that Ramses II was a pharaoh of the Exodus because the Jews built cities called Pitom and Ramses, because that could have been a span of 230 years. So that's a little bit harder to put together with our dating. Although people who do say, the other opinion that says that the Exodus was 1290 BCE, so Ramses II did rule during that time period. So he would have been the pharaoh at the time. So these are two different approaches to who was the pharaoh of the Exodus. By the way, there are other people, both Jewish scholars and archaeologists and other people who have other pharaohs that they think was a pharaoh of the Exodus. So there are a lot of different opinions. And again, the dates are kind of fluid because you have so many different sources that you're working with. And of course, we're also talking about Egyptian archaeology and timing, which was from 4,000 years ago. So like, you're not going to have exact dating to work with, but just interesting to see all these visuals and talk about the story. Now, this is a story, a source from the Rambam that I just pulled, because sometimes people will say to me, how did you go to Egypt? Isn't it, are you not allowed to go to Egypt? Doesn't the Torah say that you're not allowed to go to Egypt? So interestingly, this is a Rambam Mishnah Torah, and he talks about this exact thing. And he says that it's really a problem to reside permanently in Egypt. It is permissible to return to Egypt to conduct business or commerce or to conquer other lands, but the prohibition is only against residing permanently there. Now, some of you might say to me, but wait a minute, Rambam himself lived in Egypt, right? We know he lived in Egypt. So of course, there are other ways to deal with that. Also, of course, he went to Egypt because he had to flee from where he was living. He didn't plan on living there permanently. Lots of different opinions, but something that I did read actually is that the Rambam himself signed some of his letters saying that this is something he did that he shouldn't have done, that he felt like he shouldn't live there because of the prohibition of living there. And then just to see the prohibition that you can see over here, in the first English paragraph, it says, the Torah warned us in 3 places not to return to Egypt. Do not return in this way again. You should no longer see it, and you shall no longer ever see it again, in different places in the Torah. Again, the Rambam is saying that means really permanently residing there, not just to visit. And I do know there are a lot of rabbis, archaeologists from Israel and other places who have gone to Egypt and done a lot of research there. And I hope one day that I will be able to return to see all of these things. Okay, so I just wanted to show you a couple of tomb paintings. This is actually a tomb painting of Ramses' funeral. And you know what, let's go back to our virtual tour. Everyone's with me back in the museum. We're going back and forth just to highlight. So now we are in, I think I keep saying this, but it's one of my favorite hallways in the ancient Egyptian collection. It is a hallway full of ancient Egyptian paintings. Now, these are not the original paintings. This is probably the only thing that's not, the only objects that are not the originals. And the reason is because these paintings were painted on tomb walls in ancient Egypt, you know, anywhere from 5,000 to 3,000 years ago. So they were painted on tomb walls. And of course, the museum cannot take the tomb walls. The Met can't take the tomb walls. So what did they do? The next best thing in the 1920s, when they sent archaeologists to ancient Egypt, they also sent artists, and these artists sat in these tombs and they copied these paintings exactly. They copied them so exactly that our paintings are actually in much better condition than the original paintings, because they've been exposed to, you know, earthquakes and hot weather and people coming and touching and all that kind of stuff. So our paintings are in better condition. And what's amazing about these paintings, again, is they really show us about life in ancient Egypt. They show us about, you know, the clothing, the styles, the boats, the agriculture, what kind of animals they have, what did a chariot look like in ancient Egypt, all these things. And again, to me, it brings Tanakh, it brings the story of the Jews in Egypt to life. Even if this wasn't, the paintings weren't done in the exact same time that the Jews lived there, it was, nothing changed in ancient Egypt for about 3,000 years. So the clothing was pretty much the same, you know, the way they did agriculture, all that kind of stuff. And that we can see in all these paintings. This is a painting of a pharaoh with his wife behind him, showing that the pharaohs were more important than their wives, but their wives were right behind them, backing them up. And the tomb painting we were just looking at, I'm going to show you them clearer, just because they're a little bit hard to see here. But just to give you an idea of all the tomb paintings that we have, we learn what people did for fun in ancient Egypt, about hunting or fishing or different things that they did. And again, it really brings Tanakh to life. So we're going to go back to just see some of these paintings closer up. This is a painting, a tomb painting of Ramses II, who we had just seen his huge sculpture of his funeral. It's just a chunk of it, but just to see the hieroglyphics, of course, that's how I know that it's Ramses' funeral, and things that they're bringing to his tomb. So now we're just seeing his slippers they brought and some of his jars and jugs, but they also brought furniture to his tomb. The pharaohs were really buried with unbelievable things. King Tut was buried with even his chariot, his gold, his silver, all kinds of stuff. So now, of course, you understand why grave robbers would come and invade all these graves. So now this is another tomb painting that I really like a lot, because it's actually a painting that was taken from a tomb that was prepared by a group of artisans for them to be buried in. And it shows us an artist's workshop. So this really shows us how all these objects we're looking at were made in ancient Egypt. I mean, if you think, just take a step back and think for a minute, we're talking about these objects are anywhere from 5,000 to about 2,000 years old. Okay, so they didn't have the artistic knowledge that we have today. They didn't have art schools. They didn't have lasers, you know, so they were creating these huge sculptures, these models, carving things out of stone, just on their own, which is unbelievable. There was a large class of artists and artisans. And this workshop gives us an idea a little bit. We see people making jewelry for a tomb. We see someone making a sphinx, people making furniture. Again, it also shows us how they painted in ancient Egypt. You might remember the sculptures were all frontal. We could see the face, we could see all the features, but all the paintings, every single painting from ancient Egypt is done with a side profile. And that's how all paintings were done. So sculptures were done fully frontal, but paintings were all done with the side view. They also show the most important person is the largest, always in the paintings. The less important people are smaller, not because of their actual size, but in indicating their importance. So just a close-up of these paintings. Again, the artists copied them exactly. So anywhere, by the way, that you see where it looks like it's a little bit chipped away, the paint, that is how it looked. And the artist copied, made it look like the paint was chipped. You'll also notice that this guy's face was chipped away. Same idea with Tutmosis III chipping away at Hatshepsut's face, because they believe if you destroy a person's face, you destroy that person. So someone didn't like this guy and chipped away at his face in this painting. And here we just have someone making a painting of someone making a sphinx. Again, imagine they were making these huge, larger than life sculptures using a hammer and a chisel. a piece of nail or a metal and a rock. It's pretty amazing. I always say, I'm not an artist. I have an art history background. I couldn't have made those things, with the greatest, most advanced lasers in the world. And they are making these things using a hammer and a chisel, which is just truly amazing to me. Just another close-up of another painting, again, bringing to life the idea of how agriculture, also tying it to our story of the Jews, again, the idea of how many slaves there were in ancient Egypt and all the jobs that they did are the agricultural jobs that they did, gathering food, what kind of food they had in ancient Egypt. It's all very detailed and brings, again, not that these are Jewish slaves in the painting, but it shows us what the job of slaves were, what clothing they wore, what their jobs were, how many slaves there were, how important it was to the Egyptian economy. Okay, so our last topic that we're going to talk about is a very well-visited place in the museum. So first I'm going to bring you to that space in the museum on our virtual tour, and that is the Temple of Dendur. That the Temple of Dendur you can see in the background here, and I'll bring us closer in a few minutes. It's an ancient Egyptian temple that was in Egypt, built in Egypt. This is actually a newer object. It was built about 2,000 years ago on the banks of the Nile River. And temples were used to worship the gods and goddesses in ancient Egypt. The gods and goddesses, as I said at the beginning, were very important. The Egyptians believed that they controlled everything. And even the pharaohs would give offerings to gods and goddesses, as we saw in the Hatshepsut models. So this is an ancient Egyptian temple that was in Egypt and is now at the Met. I will tell you that story through pictures. But first, just to feel like we're in this room, you are supposed to feel like you're in ancient Egypt in this room. So we have the Nile River. We have sculptures of pharaohs. Just going around the room a little bit here. Can get see our Nile River a little bit closer. On the left-hand side, we're going to see pictures of what the temple looked like when it was in Egypt. And I will show you these pictures close up. This is the story of the temple when it was in Egypt on the banks of the Nile River. But I just want to bring you a little closer. As I said, this is an actual temple from Egypt. Here you see the Sphinx of Hatshepsut, which is in the same room with the temple. Here's the side of it. Let's see if we can get a little bit closer. You can see on the temple that they're carvings of pharaohs giving offerings to the gods and goddesses. It was a temple to the goddess Isis. Again, the Egyptians had a strong belief in their gods and goddesses. Their images are everywhere. And so you'll see why Pharaoh found the Jews so threatening, that they had their own God. They wanted to worship him in a certain way. They found that very threatening because the gods and goddesses, their gods and goddesses, they believed controlled everything. So that was a very threatening and foreign idea to them, to have a people who didn't believe in their gods and goddesses and wanted to worship them. So here's what the temple looks like in Egypt. It's a very, very popular place to visit. And over Pesach, I often bring my family, I bring groups. And again, all these objects can bring the story to life, but this room is especially designed to make you feel like you're in Egypt. It actually has also a number of sculptures of different gods and goddesses, including, we'll get close here, 4 sculptures of a goddess named Sekhmet, which was a god of plagues and pestilence. So it was a goddess actually of plague. And you might notice that it's actually the face of a pharaoh, the face of a lion and the body of a human, the opposite of the Sphinx. And this is a sculpture. There are many, many sculptures and paintings of their gods and goddesses that they imagined and again thought were all powerful. So let's just look at the story of how did we get this temple to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So as I said, the Temple of Dendur was on the banks of the Nile River, along with many other temples. This is a picture actually from the mid to late 1850s of the Temple of Dendur. You'll notice the same building that we were just looking at on the banks of the Nile River. And now we're going to see another picture of the Temple of Dendur from early 1900s. You might notice, everyone points this out right away to me, they get distracted from the temple and they see all this writing. Unfortunately, when the temple was in Egypt, there were visitors that graffitied it, unfortunately, and we can't get that out. So that's what that is. So here we have the Temple of Dendor in Egypt. You can see some of the carvings we were just looking at of the pharaohs giving offerings to the gods and goddesses. Now, I said that it was built close to the Nile River, but we haven't seen the Nile River, right? Well, remember the Nile River sometimes overflows a lot. The Egyptians believe that the gods and goddesses control that. So here we see the Nile River overflowed onto our Temple of Dendor, and that was happening a lot after the building of the Aswan Dam in 1960. So here we have the Nile River overflowing, and it's starting to overflow onto a lot of these temples that were built along the Nile River. Look what happened here. You might not notice, but this is our Temple of Dendor completely submerged by the Nile River. So the Egyptian government saw that the dam was causing a lot of flooding. They needed help. They needed engineering help. They appealed to the government in the United States in the early 1960s. The United States sent over engineers and other experts to help them kind of curb the waters and control the water so they wouldn't destroy the national treasures. And Egypt, as a thank you, said, we want to donate the Temple of Dendor to the United States. Now, of course, the United States has many, many museums, especially the Smithsonian's, that really wanted an authentic Egyptian temple. So they had a contest among museums, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art won the contest because they said they would build an entire new wing onto the museum, put in the Temple of Dendor, and make it feel like you are in Egypt. So how did we get this temple with stones made weighing tons to New York? So first of all, it was taken apart brick by brick. I think there were about 200 of these stones. They were shipped over by boat to New York. Then they were brought over by truck to the museum. Here you can see outside of the Met, they're building the new wing for, so we're talking about now we're in the, this whole process started around 1967. It was given to the museum, but the years of, bringing it over and building it up, we're talking the early 1970s. Here they're building the wing. Now it might look a little more familiar to you from our virtual tour part. You can see how it was built in the room, how they designed the whole room to make you feel like you're in Egypt with the Nile River. Even the windows are slanted. They look into Central Park, so you get kind of the heat or the sun, the climate of Egypt, everything, and they're diagonal, so it feels like a pyramid. This is what the Temple of Dendor looks like at night. Now you can see all the unbelievable engravings on them. Again, it shows us the importance of the Egyptian gods and goddesses, their importance of worshiping, and how threatening the Jews were to their belief in their gods and in their mode of worship and their mode of belief. Here we have a close-up of a pharaoh offering to the gods and goddesses. And I wanted you just to see they often represented their gods as animals, which is why people believe that they didn't eat meat in ancient Egypt, which we already disproved. But a lot of times they represented their gods and goddesses as half animal, half human to show how powerful they were. They have the powers of animals and of humans. By the way, the Temple of Dendor was originally painted, and you can see some of the leftover paint on the top. It would have been painted red and yellow and green, blue, but unfortunately, because of time elements and the Nile River overflowing, we have only paint left at the way top. But actually, the museum is now doing this cool lighting project where they're shining different lights onto the Temple of Dendor to recreate what it would have looked like. This is when I was there recently. This is something new that they're doing to, again, allow us to visualize these temples that would have been painted. And here again, we have all this new information about it because there's a lot of hieroglyphics that were carved into the temple. And as you see, unfortunately, people also visited and carved their names in. This was, again, before it was in the Met. You can see the dates were 1818 and 1820, so way before the Temple of Dendor was in the museum. So let's just go back. But again, it gives us a visualization what an ancient Egyptian temple looks like. There are a lot of these, by the way. We have one of them. There are a lot of them in Egypt. And again, just tying it back to our story of the Jews in ancient Egypt. So I'm going to end my presentation there with that. And I know I see the chat's been lighting up as I've been speaking, so I definitely want to leave some time. I know some people were just at 9 o'clock, which is an hour, and I know some people might have to leave or might not want to sit for so long. But what I'm going to do now is I would love to open up for questions. I'm going to also go to the chat and look at some of the questions. And I don't know if we want to unmute people or they want to. Somehow
Alana,
I
we
got,
lost you for a second, sorry.
okay. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the questions in the chat, and then please, if anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free. So starting off, was Meket Ray's servant killed to accompany him to the afterlife? Very possibly, right? Interestingly, usually slaves and servants were not mummified and buried because the mummification process was very expensive. Very expensive. So mostly servants were not mummified. Actually, that's why they had tomb paintings, because they believed the paintings also would come to life. So they just would paint their servants on the tombs. But we think that Meket Ray was probably a very important servant to Meket Ray, and that's why he wanted him to be buried with him. And yes, if we don't know exactly the timing, who died first, but yes, if Meket Ray did not die before, I'm sorry, if Meket Ray's servant, whose name was Wa, if Wa did not die before Meket Ray, he would have been killed to be included in Meket Ray's tomb. Yes, Meket Ray was big into bread and brewing, and that shows us the importance of grain in ancient Egypt. Yes, thank you. Hatshepsut did marry her stepbrother when her father died. It was her stepbrother, and it was her stepbrother who became her husband. It's very complicated. And he had a child by a different wife. And that's who Tutmosis III was. That's why it was her stepson, but also her nephew. Okay, yes, some people thought that Seti I might have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. He did come after Ramses II. The Ramses didn't all follow each other in direct. It wasn't like Ramses 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It didn't go that way. But there was a Ramses that ruled Egypt. A pharaoh named Ramses ruled Egypt for over 230 years between all these. Okay, someone asked that there were women figures on the boat. Who were they? Okay, good question. That was actually a family member of Meket Ray. And you could tell also by her clothing. We also have a sculpture of her in the museum. Okay, yes, right. So thank you. No, we can't refer to them as Jews because they weren't called Jews. That's why in my flyer, I always write Israelites. I sometimes forget and call them Jews, but yes, Hebrews or Israelites. Yes, they were not referred to as Jews yet. Yeah, thank you. Whoever, Stephen G, I hope you'll introduce yourself because you know a lot about yes. The Temple of Dendra, that's why I say it wasn't such an old object, right? It was built actually by a Roman governor, right? And it's one of the newer objects in the museum, and it was great that the Met got it. Liz asked, how do kids respond to this program? It makes it, yes. So I do a lot of programs with kids. When we were allowed to have groups in the museum, I used to bring a lot of day school groups around and point all these things out, and they really brought things to life. There are many other things that I don't have time to include in it, but we have a basket in the museum that you could envision Moshe being put into. It's this big basket that's woven. If anyone has time to stay, I can show you that a little more on the virtual tour. They're also fascinated, of course, with the whole mummification, so they love seeing that and talking about that. And now I'm doing it in some schools, either virtually or some schools will let me come in. And again, it really I think it really brings the story to life. And personally, I incorporate a lot of this into my family Seder. My kids are a little older now, but as they were younger and growing up, part of our Pesach preparation was making, different things from ancient Egypt, tying it into the story, and, having visuals at the Seder to make it interesting. Just some fun things that I can show you quickly is we make place cards for all of our guests every year in hieroglyphics. We put pyramids and create other things on the table to make it feel like Egypt, again, to bring the story to life so the kids can really understand and relate to things. Yes, I'm doing programs for schools and shuls around the country. By the way, when I do it for kids, a lot of people are asking me questions about kids in schools. When I do it for kids, it's a much more interactive program. I ask them what they see. I hear their ideas. We talk about it. It's a very interactive program. I want them to learn based on observation and visualizing. It's something that I think kids today sometimes have a hard time doing, and just learning from what they see. And then we talk about different ideas, and it's very interactive with the kids. Is there any indication from Tanakh that Pharaoh was female? So besides those kind of there's no direct reference that that the Pharaoh was a female. I'm not the only person who says this. I'm not going solo on this. I've read other things, and the dating does work, but there's no actual indication. But now remember, Hatshepsut didn't present herself as a female pharaoh mostly. So even references to her are often as a male. And as you saw, most of her sculptures were as a male. So you wouldn't necessarily have a reference to her as being a female pharaoh. Why do so many Israelis go to Egypt for Pesach? I didn't know that. Maybe they really want to visualize it and really experience it. It happens to be, I mean, when I was in Israel, I literally took a bus from, I mean, this was the late 90s, so it was kind of a different world, but I took a bus to Egypt, and it was an amazing experience. I guess it's an unbelievable place to visit. They're actually, if you go online, Egypt is right now building a new museum. It's called Grand Egyptian Museum. It was supposed to open, I think, a few years ago. It's now going to open, I think, next year. It is amazing, the artifacts that they're going to have. They're most of King Tut's stuff and these huge sculptures. You can look online and see it. But honestly, if I were in Israel and able to visit Egypt, I would also go. Okay, great. Okay. Yes, interesting. Yeah. Okay, so Donna wrote, the gender representation is so relevant to gender presentation in society today. Okay, good point. I don't know if anyone wants to unmute and comment or question. I'm happy to do it through the chat also. These are great questions and observations. Thank you. I can tell people were really paying attention, and you were with me here.
All right, Elana, so let's wrap it up then.